The emergency call. Dr. Marcus Johnson, head of trauma surgery at Westlake Medical Center, stood by the window of his office, staring out at the sprawling city below. The hospital buzzed with the usual controlled chaos, but Marcus felt unusually heavy that morning. His past, typically buried beneath years of achievement, was clawing its way to the surface. It was October 12th, a date Marcus never forgot, a marker of pain and growth, of nights spent nursing bruises, and of battles fought alone. His childhood had been shaped by two opposing forces, his mother's unwavering belief in him and the relentless cruelty of one boy, Bradley Thompson. Brad had been his tormentor, his shadow of doubt, the embodiment of every barrier placed in his path. Shaking off the memories, Marcus reminded himself he wasn't that scared boy anymore. He was Dr. Johnson, a respected trauma surgeon, a man who had fought his way through systemic hurdles, doubts, and poverty to stand where he was today. He turned his attention to the tasks ahead, but fate had plans to confront him with the very past he sought to escape. The buzz of his pager shattered his reverie. A Level 1 trauma was inbound. Marcus read the notification. Male, 35. MVC, motor vehicle collision. Unconscious, critical condition. With practiced precision, he grabbed his coat and made his way to the emergency room. The ER was a whirlwind of motion. Nurses prepared equipment, paramedics called out vitals, and the air smelled of antiseptic and urgency. Marcus stepped into the trauma bay, his expression calm but focused. "What do we have?" he asked, his voice cutting through the noise. Male, early 30s, one of the paramedics reported. Truck versus sit-in. Driver of the truck took the worst of it. Sustained blunt force trauma to the chest and head. BPs dropping, multiple fractures, suspected internal bleeding. Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the patient. Blood streaked the man's face, his features swollen and bruised. Marcus's hands moved automatically, assessing injuries, giving orders, and mentally mapping out the next steps. The patient needed immediate surgery. "Let's stabilize him and get him to the OR," Marcus ordered, his voice steady. As he turned to sign off on the imaging requisition, the nurse handed him the patient's ID. Marcus froze. Bradley Thompson. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Marcus turned back to the unconscious man, his face now painfully familiar beneath the bruises and blood. The years melted away in a flash of memories. Brad's sneering face, his fists landing blow after blow, his words like knives cutting into Marcus's self-worth. His hand tightened around the clipboard. For a split second, he felt a surge of anger, a flicker of bitterness he thought he buried. But then, as quickly as it came, he pushed it down. This was a patient in critical need, and he was the doctor on call. Personal feelings didn't belong here. "Let's move," Marcus said sharply. "We're wasting time." The surgical team prepped the OR as Marcus scrubbed in, his mind whirred with conflicting thoughts. Could he do this? Could he put aside decades of pain and hatred to save the life of the man who had made his childhood a living hell? The oath he'd taken as a doctor demanded it. The principles he had built his career on demanded it. But this wasn't just any patient. This was Brad. As he walked into the operating room, Marcus glanced at the monitors displaying Brad's vitals. They were dropping fast. Whatever doubts Marcus had were pushed aside as instinct and training took over. This wasn't about Brad anymore. It was about saving a life. "Scalpel," he said, his voice steady. The surgery was grueling. Brad had sustained severe internal bleeding, multiple fractures, and a collapsed lung. Marcus worked methodically, blocking out everything but the task at hand. Hours passed as the team repaired torn arteries, stabilized fractures, and ensured Brad's vitals improved. By the time Marcus stitched the final incision, exhaustion weighed heavy on him. But Brad's vitals were stable, and his condition, while critical, was no longer life-threatening. "Good work, everyone," Marcus said, stepping back. He stripped off his gloves and mask, his face unreadable. As the team wheeled Brad out to recovery, Marcus lingered in the OR, staring at his bloodied hands. Later, in his office, Marcus sat at his desk, his mind racing. Saving lives was his job, but this was different. This was Brad. The boy who had tormented him relentlessly. The man who had likely carried that hatred into adulthood. Had Brad changed? Did he even remember Marcus? The questions gnawed at him, but Marcus knew one thing for sure. He'd done what was right. He had saved a life. But as the hours passed, Marcus realized his work wasn't done. The scars Brad had left on him weren't physical, but they ran deep. Confronting them, and Brad, was inevitable. The next day, as Marcus stood outside Brad's room, he took a deep breath. The man inside had been his bully, his tormentor. Now, he was his patient. With a steadying breath, Marcus opened the door. It was time to face the past. Ghosts of the past. The room was quiet, save for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting faint shadows across the bed where Brad lay unconscious. Marcus stood in the doorway, gripping the chart tighter than necessary. His chest felt heavy, like an invisible weight pressed down on him. Brad looked different from the boy Marcus remembered. Older, of course, but also diminished. His face was pale, the lines of youth softened by the exhaustion of a hard life. The injuries from the crash made him look even more fragile. Yet despite the tubes and machines keeping him alive, Marcus could still see the ghost of the bully who had haunted his childhood. For a moment, Marcus considered leaving. Brad didn't even know he was here, didn't know that Marcus had just spent 6 hours meticulously repairing the damage that the crash, and perhaps years of bad decisions, had wrought on his body. But something rooted Marcus to the spot. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was closure, or maybe it was the undeniable fact that Brad Thompson had been part of the reason Marcus had become Dr. Johnson in the first place. Brad had been Marcus's first real challenge in life. Growing up in a rough neighborhood was hard enough, but Brad had made it feel impossible. Every insult, every punch, every shove into the lockers had left scars Marcus carried into adulthood. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the constant reminder that he didn't belong, that he would never be enough. Marcus had spent years wondering why Brad hated him so much. Was it his confidence, his love of learning, the way teachers praised him for his intelligence, or was it something simpler, something darker, like the color of his skin? Whatever the reason, Brad had made it clear, over and over again, that Marcus didn't deserve to dream of a better life. But Brad had failed. Every insult, every act of violence had only fueled Marcus's determination to prove him wrong, to prove everyone wrong. And now, standing in this hospital room, Marcus realized something. Brad wasn't just a chapter in his story. He was a catalyst. Dr. Johnson. Marcus turned to see a nurse standing in the hallway, her expression concerned. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yes," Marcus said quickly, clearing his throat. "I'm fine." He wasn't, but this wasn't the time to unpack decades of unresolved anger and pain. He nodded to the nurse and stepped into the room, letting the door close softly behind him. Brad's vitals were stable, though his condition remained critical. Marcus scanned the monitors, double-checking everything. It was a habit, something to do with his hands when his mind was racing. Finally, he set the chart on the table and pulled up a chair next to the bed. For a long time, Marcus sat in silence, staring at the man who had once made him feel so small. He thought about the last time he'd seen Brad, years ago, on the day of their high school graduation. Marcus had been named valedictorian, a moment of triumph that should have been pure joy. But even then, Brad had found a way to taint it. It had been a hot June afternoon, the kind that made the metal bleachers burn your skin if you sat too long. Marcus had stood at the podium, his speech meticulously prepared. He spoke about perseverance, about dreams, about the power of education to change lives. The crowd had applauded, his mother's cheers the loudest of all. But as Marcus walked back to his seat, He heard Brad's voice above the noise. "Enjoy it while it lasts, Johnson." Brad had sneered, his words laced with venom. "The real world's gonna eat you alive." Marcus hadn't responded. He hadn't needed to. The scholarship in his pocket, the acceptance letter to one of the best pre-med programs in the country, was answer enough. Now, years later, the tables had turned. Brad was the one who needed saving, and Marcus had been the one to save him. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Why?" Marcus muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "Why were you so angry at me? What did I ever do to you?" The questions hung in the air, unanswered. Brad's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, the machines around him beeping steadily. 2 days passed before Brad woke up. Marcus wasn't in the room when it happened, but he heard about it from one of the nurses. "He's awake," she said, her tone neutral. Still groggy, but coherent. Marcus took a moment to steady himself before heading to Brad's room. He didn't know what he expected. An apology, a confrontation, or perhaps nothing at all. But he knew one thing. He needed to see this through. When Marcus entered the room, Brad's eyes were open, though heavy with exhaustion. He turned his head slowly, wincing at the movement. When his gaze landed on Marcus, there was no recognition at first, just confusion. "Who?" Brad's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "I'm Dr. Johnson," Marcus said, keeping his tone professional. "I performed your surgery." Brad blinked, his brows furrowing. Marcus could see the gears turning in his mind, trying to piece together fragmented memories. Then, like a light bulb flickering to life, understanding dawned on Brad's face. "Marcus," he croaked, his voice thick with disbelief. Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's been a long time." Brad stared at him, his eyes wide. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their shared history hung heavy in the room, an unspoken presence that neither could ignore. Finally, Brad broke the silence. "You saved me." "Yes," Marcus said simply. Brad's face twisted, a mix of shock, guilt, and something else Marcus couldn't quite identify. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Marcus met his gaze, his own emotions swirling. "Because it's my job." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough for now. Over the next few days, Brad's recovery was slow but steady. Marcus checked in on him regularly, though their conversations were brief and superficial. But Marcus could see it, the weight of unspoken words building in Brad's eyes. He was avoiding the inevitable, just as Marcus had done for years. Finally, on the 5th day, Brad spoke. "Marcus," he said, his voice steady for the first time. "We need to talk." Marcus nodded, pulling up a chair. He wasn't sure what Brad was going to say, but he was ready to hear it. For better or worse, it was time to confront the ghosts of their past. The reckoning. The chair creaked faintly as Marcus lowered himself into it. The room felt smaller, heavier, as though the air carried the weight of years long past. He folded his hands in his lap, his usual air of calm professionalism, tempered by a storm of emotions he hadn't prepared for. Brad lay in the hospital bed, propped up slightly by a stack of pillows. His face was pale, and the bandages around his head and torso seemed to shrink him further, making him look smaller than Marcus ever remembered. Vulnerable. It was a stark contrast to the image Marcus had carried in his mind for years. Brad, towering over him in the schoolyard, fists clenched, sneering with the smugness of power. Brad cleared his throat, wincing as he did so. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke, as though it had to drag itself out of his chest. "Marcus," he began, then stopped, the words catching. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of the blanket, an uncharacteristic nervousness. "Dr. Johnson, I don't even know where to start." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Start with the truth," he said, his tone measured. "That's usually a good place." Brad let out a weak chuckle, but there was no humor in it. He looked down at his hands, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Marcus waited, his patience unwavering. This wasn't just about Brad. It was about reclaiming a part of himself he hadn't realized still needed healing. "I was a terrible person," Brad finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Back then. To you. To a lot of people. But especially you." Marcus leaned back, his expression unreadable. He'd imagined this moment before, though he'd never expected it to actually happen. The words coming out of Brad's mouth felt surreal, almost foreign. He let Brad continue. "I don't even know if saying sorry is enough," Brad said, his voice cracking. "I don't know if it ever could be. I don't even know why I was like that. I just—" He trailed off, his hands gripping the blanket tighter. Marcus could see the struggle on his face, the weight of years of pent-up guilt clawing its way out. He didn't rush Brad. He didn't need to. The silence did its own kind of work. "I was angry," Brad said after a long pause. His voice was firmer now, though still tinged with shame. "At everything. My dad, my life, myself. But I took it out on you because you were better. You had a future, and I didn't. I could see it even then, and it burnt me up inside." Marcus's jaw tightened. The admission hit harder than he expected. He had spent years wondering why Brad had singled him out, why the hatred. "I didn't hate you," Brad continued, his eyes glistening. "Not really. I hated what you represented. Hope. A way out. And I didn't have that. My dad." His voice faltered, and he looked away, blinking rapidly. "He was always angry, always blaming someone else. I grew up listening to him talk about how people like you didn't deserve what you had, how the system was against us, not you. And I believed him." Marcus exhaled slowly, his hands still folded. The room was silent except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. He had no idea how to feel. Pity. Anger. Closure. He felt all of it at once, and none of it. "You believed him," Marcus said quietly, his voice devoid of judgment. "And that gave you the right to torment me." Brad flinched at the words, his guilt visible. "No," he said quickly. "It didn't. I know that now. But back then, I was so lost, Marcus, so angry. I wanted to feel powerful, and you were." "An easy target," Marcus finished for him, his tone sharp. Brad nodded, his gaze dropping again. "Yeah," Brad admitted. "I didn't care how much I hurt you. I just wanted to drag you down to where I was. I didn't think about what it was doing to you, or what it said about me." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "Do you know what it did to me?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made Brad look up. "Do you know what it's like to walk into school every day and feel like you're walking into a battlefield? To constantly wonder if today's the day you'll break? To feel like every step forward you take will just make someone like you push me 10 steps back?" Brad's face crumpled, his shame and guilt written in every line. "I can't imagine," he said softly. "And I'm so sorry." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said honestly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I saved your life, Brad, because that's who I am. I won't let the worst parts of my past define me." Brad nodded slowly, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I understand," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm grateful for what you did, for saving me." Marcus stood, the chair scraping softly against the floor. "Recovery takes time," he said, his tone now clinical, physically and emotionally. "You'll have a lot of time to think about what comes next." Brad looked up at him, his face a mixture of pain and gratitude. "I hope I can be better," he said, "for whatever that's worth." Marcus nodded once, then turned to leave. As he reached the door, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. "It's worth something," he said, then walked out. As Marcus walked down the hospital corridor, his steps felt lighter, though his heart remained heavy. He didn't know what the future held for Brad, or for himself, for that matter. But for the first time in years, he felt like he could finally start to let go of the boy who had haunted him. Closure didn't come all at once, Marcus realized. It came in pieces, in moments, in conversations like the one he'd just had. And while the wounds Brad had inflicted might never fully heal, Marcus knew one thing for certain: they wouldn't control him anymore. The long road to redemption. The conversation with Brad lingered in Marcus's mind like an echo in a vast, empty room. He couldn't shake the image of his former tormentor, broken and vulnerable, struggling to confront his past. Brad's admission had stirred something in Marcus, something he hadn't expected. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. That night, Marcus sat in his apartment, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The city lights twinkled outside his window, a stark contrast to the storm raging within him. He thought about his mother, the woman who had been his rock during those painful years. Her words came back to him now, as clear as if she were sitting beside him. Marcus, people will try to tear you down, especially when they see you're destined for more than they can imagine. But you've got to remember, what they say, what they do, doesn't define you. How you rise above it does. She had always been right, of course. It was her strength, her unwavering belief in him, that had carried Marcus through the darkest times. And now, as he grappled with the possibility of forgiveness, her words felt like a guiding light. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the hospital early, as he always did. The sterile smell of disinfectant greeted him, a familiar comfort. He made his rounds, checking on patients, reviewing charts, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. It was a typical day, except for the persistent hum of thoughts about Brad that buzzed in the back of his mind. Brad's recovery was progressing steadily. Physically, he was healing. Emotionally, Marcus wasn't sure. Over the next few days, their interactions were polite but distant. Brad seemed hesitant, as though he didn't know how to bridge the chasm between them. Marcus, for his part, maintained his professional demeanor, but the questions he had avoided for years began to surface. Could Brad change? Did he truly deserve a second chance? And if he did, what role, if any, did Marcus play in that process? On the 5th day after Brad's surgery, Marcus found himself standing outside his patient's room once again. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. This wasn't just about checking vitals or discussing discharge plans. This was about something deeper, something harder. When he finally entered, Brad was sitting up in bed, flipping through a magazine with a distracted air. He looked up as Marcus walked in, his expression shifting from surprise to something softer. "Dr. Johnson," Brad said, setting the magazine aside. "You didn't have to come." Marcus crossed his arms, standing at the foot of the bed. "I check on all my patients," he said simply. Then, after a beat, he added, "But this visit isn't just about that." Brad's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" Marcus sighed, pulling up the chair he had sat in during their previous conversation. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," he began, his voice calm but firm. "About your anger, your father, and how you took it all out on me. I've been wondering if you really meant it. If you're ready to take responsibility for the choices you made." Brad straightened, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. "I do mean it," he said earnestly. "Every word. I know I can't undo what I did to you, but I want to be better. I don't want to be that person anymore." Marcus studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Wanting to change is a start," he said, "but it's not enough. Real change takes work. It takes owning up to the harm you've caused, not just to me, but to yourself and anyone else you've hurt." Brad nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about that a lot. About how many bridges I've burned, how many people I'd let down. My dad, he always told me the world was against us, that there was no point in trying to be better because we'd always lose. And I believed him for so long. But now, I don't want to believe that anymore. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You've got a chance to break that cycle, he said, to prove that you're more than the mistakes you've made. But it's not going to be easy. Brad met his gaze, his own filled with a mixture of determination and fear. I don't know if I can, he admitted, but I want to try. Marcus nodded. Then start by being honest, with yourself, with the people you've hurt. And if you're serious about this, you'll find a way to make it right. In the weeks that followed, Marcus saw a gradual shift in Brad. He began asking the nurses about ways to volunteer at the hospital once he was discharged, expressing an interest in helping others who had faced challenges like his own. He started writing in a notebook, jotting down thoughts and memories, trying to make sense of his past. One day he called Marcus into his room and handed him a folded piece of paper. I've been writing letters, Brad said, his voice trembling slightly. To the people I've hurt. I wrote this one for you. Marcus unfolded the paper carefully, his eyes scanning the neat handwriting. The letter was heartfelt, raw, and unflinchingly honest. Brad wrote about his childhood, his father's influence, and the anger that had consumed him. He apologized for the pain he had caused, acknowledging the long-lasting impact of his actions. By the time Marcus finished reading, his throat felt tight. He looked up at Brad, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and anxiety. I don't know if this changes anything, Brad said, his voice barely above a whisper, but I needed to say it. Marcus folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. It's a start, he said. But like I said, real change takes time. You've got a long road ahead of you, Brad. Brad nodded, a flicker of determination in his eyes. I'm ready, he said. For the first time, Marcus believed him. That evening, as Marcus walked out of the hospital, he felt a strange sense of peace. The wounds Brad had inflicted would never fully disappear, but they no longer felt as raw. Brad's journey was just beginning, but Marcus realized he had one of his own to continue. Forgiveness, he knew, wasn't about letting someone off the hook. It was about freeing yourself from the weight of the past. And while Marcus wasn't sure if he could ever fully forgive Brad, he was willing to try. For himself, if for no one else. Turning points. Brad Thompson's recovery was nearing its end, at least physically. His ribs had started to heal, his bruises faded, and the stitches along his abdomen had been removed. The external wounds were mending, but Marcus knew that the real work, the internal healing, was only just beginning. As a doctor, Marcus had always focused on measurable progress, heart rates, blood pressure, lab results. But with Brad, the markers of improvement were less tangible. There was the way he interacted with the nurses, now thanking them for even the smallest gestures. There was the absence of bitterness in his tone when he talked about his circumstances. And then there were the questions. Brad was full of them. He wanted to know how Marcus had found his way out of the neighborhood they had both come from, how he had broken free of the cycle that had trapped so many others. For Marcus, these conversations were strange but necessary. Each question forced him to revisit memories he had long since buried, nights spent hunched over his schoolbooks by candlelight during power outages, the sound of his mother's quiet sobs when she thought he couldn't hear her, and the constant fear that his dreams were too fragile to survive the harshness of reality. Brad's curiosity felt genuine, though, and Marcus couldn't deny that it stirred something in him. Maybe, just maybe, Brad was serious about changing. One afternoon, as Marcus made his rounds, he stopped by Brad's room. He knocked lightly before stepping inside. Brad was sitting upright, a notebook in his lap, his pen hovering over the page as though he was trying to wrestle the right words into existence. "Dr. Johnson," Brad said, looking up. There was a nervous energy about him. "Got a minute?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Depends," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "What's on your mind?" Brad hesitated, tapping the pen against the notebook. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about taking responsibility. And I realized I don't even know where to start." Marcus crossed his arms, studying him. "Start with what you can control," he said. "What do you want to change?" Brad looked down at the notebook, his jaw tightening. "Everything," he admitted. "But mostly, myself. I've spent so long being angry, blaming everyone else for my problems. I don't want to do that anymore. I want to be better." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's good," he said. "But wanting isn't enough. Change takes action. You need to figure out what that looks like for you." Brad sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That's the hard part. I don't have a clue where to begin." Marcus considered this for a moment, then stepped into the room and pulled up a chair. "Let me tell you something," he said. "When I was a kid, I had every reason to give up. The odds were stacked against me. And people like you," he paused, letting the words hang in the air, "made it even harder. But my mom always told me that giving up wasn't an option. She said I had to be the one to break the cycle." Brad listened intently, his eyes fixed on Marcus. "I decided that I wasn't going to let my circumstances define me," Marcus continued. "I worked harder than anyone else because I had to. And when people told me I didn't belong, I used that as fuel. Every insult, every setback, it all became part of the fire that kept me going." Brad swallowed hard, his expression thoughtful. "But what if you don't have that fire?" he asked quietly. "What if you've spent your whole life feeling like you're not good enough?" Marcus leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Then you find it," he said firmly. "Because it's there, Brad. You just have to dig deep enough to see it. And once you do, you hold on to it with everything you've got." Brad nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I want to try," he said, "but I don't even know where to start." Marcus stood, placing a hand on the back of the chair. "Start small," he said. "One step at a time. Volunteer. Take a class. Find a way to give back. And most importantly, don't make excuses. You're going to have bad days, but that doesn't mean you stop trying." Later that evening, Brad called his nurse into the room. "Can I get information on any volunteer programs around here?" he asked. "I want to do something useful while I'm recovering." The nurse smiled, surprised but pleased. "I'll see what I can find," she said. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. A week later, Brad was discharged. As Marcus signed the paperwork, he handed Brad a small card with his office number on it. "If you ever need guidance, or just someone to call when you feel like giving up, don't hesitate to reach out," Marcus said, his tone serious. "I'm not saying I'll have all the answers, but I've been where you are. I know what it takes to climb out." Brad took the card, his fingers trembling slightly. "Thanks," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. I mean it." Marcus nodded. "Take care of yourself," he said. "And remember, this is just the beginning." In the weeks that followed, Marcus heard through the hospital grapevine that Brad had started volunteering at a local community center. He was working with at-risk youth, sharing his story and helping them navigate the challenges he had once faced. One day, Marcus received an email from Brad. It was short and to the point, but it carried more weight than anything Brad had ever said aloud. "Dr. Johnson, I wanted to let you know that I'm trying. I started working with kids at the center, and it feels good. Like maybe I can make up for some of the things I've done. I know I've got a long way to go, but I wanted you to know that I'm not giving up. Thank you for saving my life and for showing me that it's worth something. Brad." Marcus stared at the screen for a long time after reading the message. He thought about his own journey, about the people who had helped him along the way, and about the boy he used to be, the one who had been beaten down but never broken. Brad's road to redemption would be long and fraught with challenges, but Marcus realized something important. It wasn't just Brad who was healing. He was too. The wounds of the past were still there, but they no longer felt as raw. For the first time in years, Marcus felt a sense of peace. Maybe this was what closure looked like, not erasing the pain, but finding a way to move forward in spite of it. The ripple effect. Months passed, and the memory of Brad Thompson began to fade into the backdrop of Marcus Johnson's busy life. The hospital remained a constant whirlwind, with new emergencies arriving every day. Marcus threw himself into his work, his dedication unwavering. Yet, every now and then, he thought of Brad, not with bitterness, but with cautious curiosity. He wondered if the man had truly embraced change, or if his promises had faded the moment he left the hospital. One evening, as Marcus prepared to leave for the night, a knock came at his office door. He looked up to see Angela, one of the hospital's administrative assistants, standing there with a hesitant smile. "Dr. Johnson, you've got a visitor in the lobby," she said. Marcus frowned. "At this hour? Who is it?" She shrugged. "Didn't give a name. Just said he needed to see you." Marcus sighed, setting down his paperwork. Visitors at the end of a long day were rarely good news. He made his way to the lobby, his mind already cataloging potential scenarios. A patient's family member with questions, a journalist looking for a quote, or perhaps someone delivering yet another donation request. When he reached the lobby, Marcus stopped in his tracks. It was Brad. He looked different, clean-shaven, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and jeans that actually fit. He was holding a small stack of papers, his shoulders slightly hunched as though bracing for a rejection. When he saw Marcus, he straightened, his expression nervous but determined. "Dr. Johnson," Brad said, his voice steady but soft. "Thanks for seeing me." Marcus folded his arms, his expression neutral. "I wasn't expecting to see you again," he said honestly. "What brings you here?" Brad took a deep breath, holding out the stack of papers. "I wanted to show you something." Marcus hesitated, then took the papers. As he flipped through them, his eyes widened. They were program outlines, proposals, and testimonials. At the top of the first page, bold letters read, "Pathways Forward, a community outreach initiative." Brad cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting. "After I started volunteering at the center, I realized there was a bigger need out there, kids who are on the verge of going down the same road I did. I wanted to do more, so I started putting this together. It's a program to mentor at-risk youth, help them find scholarships, job training, stuff like that." Marcus's eyes scanned the pages, taking in the details. It wasn't just an idea. It was a well-thought-out plan. Brad had clearly put in the time and effort to make this more than just a pipe dream. "I've been working on this for months," Brad continued, his voice gaining confidence. "I pitched it to the community center, and they loved it. We're starting with a small pilot program, but the goal is to expand citywide. I wanted you to see it, because none of this would have happened without you." Marcus looked up, his brow furrowed. "Without me?" he repeated, his tone skeptical. Brad nodded. "Yeah," he said firmly. "You didn't just save my life. You showed me what it means to really live. To stop making excuses, to take responsibility for my actions. You were right. It's not easy. Some days, it feels impossible. But I'm doing it. And I wanted you to know that." Marcus studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity. But Brad's eyes were clear, his posture steady. He wasn't the angry, bitter boy Marcus remembered from their school days. He wasn't even the broken man who had been wheeled into Marcus's operating room months ago. He was someone else entirely. Someone who had found purpose in the wreckage of his past. "Why now?" Marcus asked, his voice even. "Why come back here to tell me this?" Brad hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Because I figured if I could face you, I could face anyone." In the weeks that followed, Marcus found himself thinking about Brad's program more often than he expected. The papers sat on his desk, a reminder of how far both of them had come. He even reached out to a few contacts, connecting Brad with organizations that could help fund and support the initiative. One evening, Marcus received an email from Brad. Attached were photos from the first day of the program's pilot run. Marcus clicked through the images, his heart unexpectedly full. There were kids of all ages, some shy and withdrawn, others beaming with excitement. Brad stood among them, laughing and engaging, his presence magnetic. It was clear the kids looked up to him, not as a hero, but as someone who understood their struggles. At the bottom of the email was a simple note. Dr. Johnson, I thought you'd like to see what you helped make possible. Thank you for everything. Brad. Months turned into a year, and Marcus began to notice subtle changes in his own life. He felt lighter, more open. The weight of the past didn't press down on him as heavily as it once had. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't about absolving someone else. It was about freeing yourself. One afternoon, as Marcus walked through the hospital's lobby, he spotted a familiar face. It was one of his young mentees, a boy named Terrence, who had been shadowing him as part of a pre-med internship program. Terrence had grown up in the same neighborhood as Marcus and had reminded him of his younger self, driven, hopeful, and eager to prove himself. Hey, Dr. Johnson, Terrence said, grinning. Guess what? I got accepted into the early admissions program at the university. Marcus beamed, clapping a hand on the boy's shoulder. That's incredible, Terrence. I'm proud of you. As Terrence walked away, Marcus felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. His own journey hadn't been easy, but it had led him here, to a place where he could inspire others to rise above their circumstances. He thought of Brad, of the kids Brad was now mentoring, and of the countless lives that could be changed by a single act of compassion. The ripple effect was undeniable. That evening, Marcus sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline. The past and present felt intertwined, no longer in conflict but in harmony. He thought of his mother's words once more. You've got something in you that they'll never have. Don't ever let them take that away. Marcus smiled to himself. They hadn't, and they never would. Full circle. It was a crisp autumn morning, nearly 2 years since Brad Thompson had been wheeled into Marcus Johnson's operating room. The seasons had shifted, and with them, so had the lives of both men. For Marcus, the memory of those long-ago schoolyard taunts had lost their sting, replaced by the knowledge that people could change, even someone like Brad. For Brad, life had taken a direction he never thought possible. Marcus's morning had started like any other. Rounds, meetings, and a full slate of surgeries awaited him. Yet as he walked through the hospital corridors, something about the day felt different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was an air of anticipation, like the first few moments before a symphony begins. That feeling became clearer when Angela, the hospital's administrative assistant, intercepted him mid-stride. Dr. Johnson, she said with a smile, there's someone here who wants to see you. Marcus paused, a slight frown crossing his face. Another visitor, he asked, his tone more amused than annoyed. Who is it this time? Angela simply nodded toward the lobby. Go see for yourself. Curiosity piqued, Marcus made his way to the main entrance. The lobby was bustling with the usual chaos of patients, families, and staff, but one figure stood apart. It was Brad. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a young boy, no older than 12, with wide, nervous eyes and a tightly clutched notebook. Brad caught sight of Marcus and waved, his expression somewhere between excitement and gratitude. Dr. Johnson, Brad said as Marcus approached, extending a hand. His grip was firm, his posture confident. He looked healthier, stronger, and more at peace than Marcus had ever seen him. Good to see you again. Brad, Marcus said, shaking his hand. I wasn't expecting you. Brad smiled, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. I wanted you to meet someone. This is Jalen. He's one of the kids from the Pathways Forward program. And, well, I think he'd like to tell you something. The boy glanced up at Marcus, his expression a mix of awe and shyness. He held out the notebook, and Marcus took it, flipping through the pages. They were filled with sketches, diagrams, and neatly written notes about the human body, drawings of hearts, lungs, and even a rudimentary attempt at a surgical procedure. I want to be a doctor, Jalen said, his voice barely above a whisper. Like you. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a warmth spreading through his chest. He looked at Brad, whose proud smile spoke volumes. This wasn't just a child with a dream. This was proof of the ripple effect Brad had created. Proof that change, real change, could inspire others to dream bigger than their circumstances. "Jalen," Marcus said, crouching down to meet the boy's eyes. "That's an incredible goal. And if you're willing to work hard, there's no reason you can't achieve it." The boy nodded eagerly, his grip on his notebook tightening. "Mr. Thompson said you'd say that," he said, his smile breaking through the shyness. "He told me about how you grew up and how you didn't let anything stop you." Marcus glanced at Brad, who gave a small, almost sheepish shrug. "I might have shared a few stories," Brad said. "I thought he should know where you came from and how much you've accomplished." Over the next hour, Marcus sat with Brad and Jalen in a quiet corner of the hospital's cafeteria. They talked about Jalen's interests, his struggles in school, and his dreams of one day helping people the way Marcus did. Brad listened quietly for the most part, but every so often, he chimed in with words of encouragement, guiding Jalen with the same care and patience Marcus had once shown him. When the conversation wound down, Jalen excused himself to explore the hospital's lobby, leaving Marcus and Brad alone. "You've come a long way," Marcus said, his voice quiet but filled with genuine respect. Brad nodded, his expression reflective. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted. "You didn't just save my life that day. You gave me a chance to find purpose. I didn't think I deserved it, but you showed me that it's not about what we think we deserve. It's about what we do with the chances we're given." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying the man before him. Brad wasn't just apologetic anymore. He was transformed. The anger, bitterness, and self-doubt that had once defined him were gone, replaced by a quiet confidence and a deep sense of responsibility. "And Jalen?" Marcus asked, gesturing toward the boy, who was now peering at a model of a human skeleton in the lobby. "He's one of many." Brad nodded. "We've got 20 kids in the program now," he said. "Some are like Jalen, full of potential but lacking the support to chase their dreams. Others are just trying to stay out of trouble. Either way, we're doing what we can to show them there's a better path." Marcus felt a swell of pride, though he kept his expression composed. "You've done good work, Brad," he said, "more than I ever expected." Brad met his gaze, his own eyes shining. "You taught me what it means to rise above," he said. "I couldn't have done this without you." That evening, as Marcus prepared to leave the hospital, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. His life, once shaped by pain and struggle, had become a beacon for others. And now, through Brad, that light was reaching even further. As he stepped into the cool evening air, Marcus felt an unexpected sense of closure. The scars Brad had left on his childhood hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they had become part of a story of resilience, redemption, and the power of second chances. For Marcus, life would continue as it always had, saving lives, mentoring young minds, and pushing the boundaries of what was possible. But now there was a new chapter to his story, one where the cycle of pain had been broken and hope had taken its place. And as he walked to his car, Marcus couldn't help but smile. For the first time in years, the weight of the past was gone. All that remained was the promise of what lay ahead.